Hello friends, it's the Stitches. Today I'm going to show you 3 super easy ways to alter a basic t-shirt. Each of my shirts was sourced from a local thrift store. I was lucky enough to find some that were in basically new condition and didn't need to be re-dyed. But if all you can find is faded black shirts, they can be touched up with a little dye and hot water so long as the fabric isn't worn out. We'll start with the simplest project that requires the least skill and work our way to the most complex project. So for our first t-shirt, we're simply going to add some embroidery to this basic black top. In order to properly visualize what the finished project will look like, I strongly recommend sketching out your design first. It's okay if you draw something and then change your mind and decide you don't like it, but if you start with a t-shirt and just jump right into the DIY and at the end of the project decide you don't like it, you kind of just wasted your materials. For example, here's a couple designs I decided I didn't like, so I simply won't be making them. Once I had decided on a design for my embroidery project, I printed out the actual graphic on some printer paper and decided where on my shirt I wanted it. You'll need a couple products before you can start stitching. Some white wax paper to transfer the design, and some stabilizer to tuck into the embroidery hoop. First, we'll cut the stabilizer to size. There will be quite a bit of waste, unfortunately, but it does need to be big enough to cover both the graphic and fit into the embroidery hoop, which will be quite a bit bigger than the design. Next, since my fabric is black, I can pretty much only use white to create a visible transfer. Place some wax paper face down on the fabric, and then layer the design on top, making sure it's positioned where you want the final design to be. Using a pencil, trace over the design using a very firm pressure. If you're using a lighter colored shirt to do this, be sure to test your wax first to make sure it'll actually come out of the fabric. Do this in sort of an inconspicuous spot on the inside of the garment. But the wax comes off of this particular knit pretty easily, which is usually fine for doing things like marking where darts are supposed to be, but for this embroidery we want the markings to be a bit more stable. So next we'll trace over the wax with a white chalk pencil that won't rub off as easily. Now it's time to tuck the fabric, with the stabilizer backing it, into an embroidery hoop. It's best to use a hoop that your whole design can fit into, that way you don't risk losing your markings, but my design is a bit too wide for that and I don't have a big enough embroidery hoop for it, so this will work well enough. To stitch my design, I'm just using a very simple back stitch. This method works best for very basic line art that doesn't require any fill stitches or anything like that. I'm definitely not an embroidery expert, I still consider myself a beginner. This is actually my first time embroidering knit fabric, and it is a bit more difficult than embroidering woven fabric, so some of my lines are a little bit wobbly, but I think the finished product looks charming. It's a bit more of a doodle, but in stitch form. Once the design is finished, we can remove the hoop and tear away the stabilizer. This particular stabilizer is designed to wash off, so I'm not too concerned with leaving a few little bits. There are many types of stabilizer, so feel free to use whatever you think will work best for you. I've even seen people use regular copy paper, although I suspect that using paper would probably dull your needle way faster, and it actually has to be soaked off in water, so I'm not sure I recommend that, but it would be a cheap option if you don't want to buy something you will basically just be throwing away. After rinsing or brushing off the leftover marking chalk or wax or whatever you used to mark your shirt and a quick iron, our first project is finished. Of course, I have a little before and after for you all, however this is the least dramatic change of any of the shirts I'm going to show you today. Our top just looks a little bit more personalized. This project is a great way to add something simple to a casual shirt. I recommend putting embroidery on a looser fit or even an oversized t-shirt, because it obviously won't preserve the stretch of the knit, so you don't want to do this on anything super fitted. but on a loose t-shirt, it looks really nice. And you can add a graphic to a solid item without having to worry about losing paint in the washing machine. The embroidery just adds that tiny bit of spice to casual outfits without requiring a sewing machine or years of DIY skill building. So now let's move on to our second project. For this next DIY, I'll be using a sewing machine. You can do this by hand, but a machine will give better results. We'll be taking some mesh fabric from another garment in my wardrobe I just haven't been reaching for and have pretty much replaced with items I like more, and using it to add some applique stripes to this more fitted hot pink t-shirt. I was originally going to use a long sleeve shirt that I have in my stash of items to upcycle, but I discovered that my mesh piece wasn't quite wide enough, and while I could make it work, I'd rather just save my long sleeve t-shirt for something else. Making stripes is a simple matter of measuring and cutting the mesh fabric and adhering it to the shirt. I should mention that this mesh fabric is stretchy, so when it's added to a knit t-shirt, it won't prevent the shirt from being able to stretch when I put it on. I cut the stripes for the sleeves off of the sleeves of the mesh top so it would be fitted to size, but I still wound up needing to recut them a little bit. I cut 4 main stripes originally, but when I compared my project to my design, I realized I only needed to cut 3. Oh well. All my extra fabric will be saved in my knit scrap bin to be used on future projects. Having a little mesh on hand, especially since this fabric doesn't fray at all, is always useful. Applique has a bad habit of wiggling around when it's stitched on the machine, so to prevent that, we'll use some fabric glue to tack everything in place. I've never used fabric glue for applique before, so this is a bit of an experiment for me, but I think I'd like to use it for all of my applique projects from now on. Normally, applique is thoroughly pinned in place, but I found the fabric glue to be way more convenient. I just used little drops of glue applied to the parts of the mesh where the little strands crossed each other. You'll also want something in between the layers of fabric so the glue doesn't soak through the fabric and glue the front to the back on accident if you use a little bit too much. If you don't want to use fabric glue and aren't using a mesh fabric that's full of holes, you can also use a product called Wonder Under to hold down the applique pieces before you stitch them. Wonder Under is similar to interfacing, but it has adhesive on both sides of the textile instead of just one. However, it doesn't work well for knits, so I would reserve it for adding applique to woven fabrics. After the fabric pieces have been glued, it needs to sit for a couple of hours to set. In theory, you could just glue the applique on and leave it like that, but it won't be very long lasting, and eventually the applied fabric will start to peel off. So once the glue is dry, it's time to take this over to the machine. When you stitch knit fabric, you need to use a knit stitch. On the machine, this looks like a zigzag stitch that's just been squished a little bit. If your machine doesn't have a knit stitch, which it should, but if it doesn't, you can use a narrow zigzag stitch instead. Start by securing the ends of the fabric in place and trimming away any excess. Then stitch along the top and the bottom of each stripe. This will make everything nice and secure, so even as the glue weakens with time and washing, the applique won't ever come off. Here's a closer look at what the stitching should look like. The before and after looks a lot more dramatic this time. It actually looks like a whole new top. This went from a very basic and generic tee to an actual statement item. Time to try it on. It was a simple DIY, but the final product is really striking. If you struggle finding statement items in your budget secondhand, you can always try making them yourself with a project like this, making it easier to achieve the alternative aesthetic of your dreams on a smaller budget. I like the vibrant color on this tee, but I think something like this would look really cool if you used a pastel shirt as your base as well, especially if you managed to find some white mesh, but pastels contrasted with black also looks equally cool. Our last project will be the most demanding in terms of skill, but it's easily my favorite piece that I made for this video. But before we get into it, it's time for a quick commercial break. Now that we're back, let's discuss how to make the third and final project I'll be showing you today. For this DIY, we'll be adding some zippers and a little bit of distressing to this black shirt. First, we'll use an iron to get the fold lines out of the zippers. I'm using two 11-inch zippers and one 9-inch zipper, but feel free to use whatever sizes fit your shirt best. After the zippers can lay flat again, we'll press the little extra bit of fabric at the ends under, because in my opinion, it just looks better and more finished. You can leave them as is for a more deconstructed look if you want though. Arrange the zippers on the shirt. I'm going for a bit of a diagonal, but do whatever looks best to you. Once you have an arrangement that's satisfying, we'll ditch the pins on this project as well, and use the fabric glue to hold the zippers in place before stitching them down.
You can also use wash-away basting tape. I used to use this all the time before my local craft store stopped carrying it, but it still exists online.
Once the glue is dry, we can stitch the zippers down. Zippers are the bane of every crafter's existence, so whatever you have to do to get it secured is valid. But I used a zipper foot to stitch the zipper close to the teeth first, and then I stitched along the ends and the outer edge so that my zipper is very secure and none of the fabric moves around. I just think topically applied zippers look a lot nicer when they're thoroughly stitched down and the fabric can't be lifted up anywhere. Another little detail to think about is the zipper pulls. I got these little replacement pulls that have an O-ring at the end because I just really like the aesthetic of them. I've actually used these exact same pulls before. To remove the old zipper pulls, take a good pair of wire cutters and clip them off. Toss these, and then open up the new pulls. These ones are meant to be squeezed together and then it hinges open, and then you just pop the new ones on. Now I'll break out the white chalk pencil again and draw the lines where I'd like to cut for distressing. Cut along the line and give the fabric a good pull. This is obviously optional, as I know not everyone likes the look of holes in their clothing. You could easily stop here, but I like the idea of using this top for layering, and it would be cool if the zippers were actually functional, so I could open them and display a shirt that's worn underneath it. So using a small pair of scissors, I'll open up the fabric underneath the zippers so that they can be opened and closed. This knit fabric doesn't fray, so we won't have to worry about finishing or fray check or anything like that. And with that, our third project is finished. So let's look at our before and after. We've gone from a very basic item to a really useful staple. Unlike the last project, I think the fact that it's still one solid color will make it very versatile. I'd like to do this again, but with a pastel pink top and matching pink or white zippers. But to be honest, I've been really struggling to find pastels in my local thrift shops lately, so I think I'll probably have more luck dyeing a white shirt. As I said before, this top is easily my favorite one that I made today. It actually seems like something you might buy from a shop like Punk Rave or similar, but without paying $50 for it. A thrifted shirt and 3 metal zippers and pulls comes to about $20, maybe $25 altogether, so it's a great way to get a very recognizably alternative shirt on a lower budget. And you can always skip the replacement zipper pulls and save a little extra money. If you like versatile, but still interesting items, I think this would make a really great staple for an alternative wardrobe. Just don't let the zipper installation intimidate you. That's all for today. I hope this was a useful tutorial, or at the very least was able to give you some ideas for ways to add decoration to simple, easily thrifted items. Perhaps you already have some items in your wardrobe that feel a little too plain that you can apply some of these techniques in this video to, so you can make them a little more exciting and personal. If you have any ideas for more simple projects that you'd like to see me show you how to do, feel free to request them in the comments below. I'd like to make a few more simple, in-depth tutorials that can be helpful for beginners. but I'll also have plenty of more complex sewing vlogs coming in the future. And with that, I'll see you all next time. Bye!